Good evening. Welcome to a delayed The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is October 4th, 2019. Tonight, does any party have a winning climate change plan? Climate change and the environment are issues in this election like never before. All polling shows that Canadians across the spectrum recognize the urgency to take real action and change the way things have been done for so long. The reasons vary, from the concern for future generations, to the dependency on a dying industry, to the mass extinction of flora and fauna, to the sheer cost on our way of life. The generational divide on this growing problem will continue to get more pronounced, and political parties will stake out their positions based on the demographic support to a certain degree. Despite the scientific and anecdotal evidence that has been amassing for decades, political will continues to be elusive. There is no issue more indicative of what political power actually listens to, and it's not the citizenry or the evidence. Elaborate conventions and documents with no binding provisions are presented as progress, with no tangible punishment for failing to honor them. Fossil fuel subsidies continue unabated despite the promise of eventual elimination. Substantive change in energy use and production have not happened. So what are the positions of the major parties being sold in this election? The View Up Here will try to translate the platforms and hold them up to the light of reality. Is there a best option of what's likely? Will positions from the parties with no chance of forming government have any impact? Or are they well aware there will be no lasting impact of proposing to go somewhere that in this current reality is not nearly as simple as they claim? Climate change is not going away, but apparently neither is politics. Welcome to the show. Like I said, on a 2-day delay. Thank you, VTR. This will be kind of a circle show. We're going to start out with something from a couple months ago, not even 1 month ago, for what it was looking like, where the four major parties were going to be with their environmental policy. We'll go through a little bit of review from numerous sources, including Andrew Leach, and then we'll end up back where we started with a grading of these platforms, shall we say. I'm going to start with September 12th, 2019, in the Narwhal. This is by Jimmy Thompson. Canada's major parties on all things environment. Explained. Well, sort of. Environmental issues are top of mind for more Canadians than ever before in this year's election. It's an important issue to Canadians in every riding, and the parties know it. In a Forum Research poll in July, 26% of respondents said the environment was their top concern. Leapfrogging the economy is the number one issue. In the 2015 election, the economy was by far the most important issue to voters. It's also only the second election in which all four major parties openly accept the reality of climate change as something that demands our attention. Strategies vary on how to reduce carbon emissions, but at least federally, it's no longer a question of debating the science. Climate change policy isn't the only way the parties are flexing their environmental bona fides, however. Conservation, transportation, and energy are on the platforms, as are lower impact but still high-profile issues like plastic pollution and green jobs. It all makes for a lot of platforms to scroll through. So here's a rundown on what environmental policies the federal parties are offering Canadians in the 2019 election. Climate change. Canada is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Its northern reaches are warming even more quickly. That has consequences for polar bears, sure, but it's also a threat to northern roads and communities. It's exacerbating wildfires and a biodiversity crisis. So it's not surprising to see the issue being taken on by the federal parties. Justin Trudeau won on a platform in 2015 that heavily referenced climate change while promising specific solutions to that and other environmental problems. Andrew Scheer appears eager to shed the Conservative Party's reputation for environmental backwardness while sticking to its expected business-friendly approach. Elizabeth May's Greens are advocating for radical overhauls to the economy, and the NDP under Jagmeet Singh is advocating for more ambitious measures than the Liberals while maintaining many of the broad strokes of their plan. The Liberals so far have spent the summer touting and reinforcing the 50 or so specific actions they've taken since 2015. Chief among those is the carbon tax, which kicked in April at $20 a ton and will rise each year up to $50 a ton by 2022. United Nations economists say that to be effective, a carbon price will have to come much higher by 2030 to at least $135 per ton. The Liberals have no such plan. The carbon tax has also been criticized for being overly cautious with respect to industry, allowing for too much pollution in the name of not harming competitiveness. The Liberals have done other work to curb emissions, however. They've set a target of 30% of light-duty vehicles being electric by 2030 and brought in a new fuel standard to limit the carbon content in fuels used in transportation, heating, and industry. They've invested billions in public transit in order to reduce the carbon footprint of transportation, but appear to have abandoned the promise to rapidly expand the federal fleet of electric vehicles. In the last budget, they brought in a $5,000 subsidy for new EV purchases. The Conservatives have come late to the Climate Party, but they have shown up at last. The title of Andrew Scheer's Environment and Climate Platform, A Real Plan, seems to be intended as a dig at the Liberals, but comes across as a marvelous cell phone. Regardless, the plan is indeed real and acknowledges the reality of man-made climate change in its third paragraph. The party has said it supports the Paris Accord, but stopped short of committing to meeting Canada's targets. In contrast to the carbon tax, which the Conservatives have long branded as a tax grab, and which they plan to repeal, the Conservatives' climate plan is intended to be consumer-friendly, depending on new technology rather than a reduction in consumption or expensive overhauls. It would require big polluters to pay into an investment fund that would then be spent on green tech. However, it's not clear exactly how that investment would actually meet the planned reductions. The Conservatives do not mention transit in their climate plan, but do promise to provide regulatory support for an LNG facility on the West Coast that they say could lower the emissions of marine transportation. They also say they will work on developing electric vehicle technology, but make no promises on that front. A big part of the Conservatives' plan is to help other countries lower their own emissions, which they argue can be done for cheaper in developing countries, where more emissions-intensive industries like coal-fired power plants are more common. The Conservatives have promised to scrap the Liberals' fuel standard. The party is also pushing carbon capture and storage, which has been developed with some success in Saskatchewan and Alberta, but not rolled out yet in any large-scale way. The Green Party has presented the most radical plan for climate change of any party. It is symbolically heavy on urgency, for instance, establishing a nonpartisan survival cabinet that would have the same grave mandate as a wartime cabinet and includes the most ambitious measures to cut emissions seen yet on the federal level. The party proposes doubling Canada's emissions reduction targets and would raise the carbon tax as high as the UN says it needs to be, to $130 a ton by 2030. The Greens promise to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, ban fracking and oil imports, and eliminate coal and natural gas by 2030. The latter has been criticized, along with their plan to retrofit every building in Canada to be carbon neutral, as not feasible within that timeline. Currently, fossil fuels make up 20% of Canada's electricity generation, with huge regional disparities. And vacating every home in the country for retrofits would entail a scale of displacement without precedent in Canada. The Greens are also planning mitigation measures to prepare for those levels of climate crisis we can no longer avoid. Those include fortifying dikes and dams against flooding, buying water bombers, and assisting those who work in sectors that will be first affected by climate change. The Greens are the only party so far to mention rail, which they say would get new investment. The Green Party would require that all new cars sold in Canada be electric by 2030. They would increase bus service to rural areas, purchase electric buses, make employer-provided bus passes tax-free, and add to low-emissions transportation in cities such as bike lanes and pedestrian infrastructure. The party would also oppose expansion of infrastructure that enables urban sprawl. The New Democratic Party plans to maintain the carbon price set out by the Liberals until 2022, with a few tweaks. The party would remove the additional exemptions the Liberals added to their carbon price for heavy polluters, making them work harder to remain competitive internationally. Rebates on the carbon tax would be changed. Rather than being sent out to all Canadians, the rebates would no longer be sent to the wealthiest Canadians. The NDP also promises a Canadian climate bank, which would provide $3 billion for low-carbon innovation. Low-interest loans would be offered for renovations on a longer timeline than the Greens, with plans to have all housing retrofitted by 2050. On transportation, the NDP says it will increase funding, particularly to low-emissions transit projects. It would maintain the $5,000 incentive for EV purchases while eliminating federal sales tax on them. For electric vehicles made in Canada, the NDP says it would eventually raise that incentive to $15,000. It expands on the Liberals' seemingly broken promise to increase the federal fleet of electric vehicles, saying all government vehicles, which includes things like Canada Post trucks, will be 100% electric by 2025. Energy is the root of the climate crisis, from coal-fired electrical plants to gasoline-driven cars to bunker oil-burning ships. Canadians pump a lot of carbon into the air, but our energy system causes other problems too, like the deterioration of air quality, pollution of waterways, oil spills on land and sea, and the destruction of land for hydroelectricity. Some of the most heated political battles in recent memory in Canada are based on energy. The TMX has pitted First Nations, the federal government, two provincial governments, as well as municipalities against one another, and has divided public opinion. Likewise, for the now defunct Energy East and Northern Gateway projects. And it's not just fossil fuels. The Site C Dam is an ongoing saga that is tearing apart northern BC. Given these struggles, the parties all have their own promises to reform Canada's energy grid, or in the case of the Conservatives, return it to the way it was. The NDP has set a target of powering Canada with zero carbon electricity by 2050. The interim goal is net carbon-free electricity by 2030. So what's the difference there? Net carbon-free usually refers to electricity generation that includes carbon offsets, stuff like carbon capture, planting trees, or subsidizing clean energy. Whereas zero carbon energy would mean no carbon is produced during generation. The NDP would abandon the TMX, which the Liberals bought in as-is condition for $4.5 billion, but which will eventually cost double that to build. In the same vein, the party would stop fossil fuel subsidies, which Environmental Defense estimates still total $3.3 billion a year in Canada. A final major element of the NDP energy platform is centered around manufacturing, building components for green energy in Canada, building an interconnected smart energy grid, and developing locally owned energy projects. The Green Party would likewise eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and go further by divesting from fossil fuels at the federal level, an example they hope other jurisdictions would follow. The Greens would also abandon TMX, along with all other pipeline expansion, ban oil imports, and support the existing tanker ban on the north coast of BC. The Greens oppose nuclear energy, saying it's too costly and too risky. They plan to develop a national electricity grid plan and transition the current electrical grid to a more efficient system. The Greens want wind to make up 20% of national electricity production by 2025. That would be a four-fold increase from today, as well as ramping up geothermal and solar to each bring 25 new gigawatts of electricity online. The ban on oil imports, the party has suggested, would switch Canada's oil supply to one entirely dependent on Alberta, which is in line with what the Conservatives have promised for 2030. The Greens' boldest claim is that through retrofits and efficiency improvements, Canada could easily reduce energy demand by 50%. The Greens see demand for oil and gas declining, and its policies would accelerate that decline. To soften the blow to workers in the oil and gas industry, the Greens would bring in a retraining program to teach them how to work in renewables. The Liberal Party, so far, it's been a mix of buying a pipeline, powering a natural gas production and transportation boom with clean energy, and not developing an energy strategy. In 2017, the government introduced legislation to ban oil tankers off the north coast of BC, passed into law earlier this year. In January, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced federal support for Canada's first geothermal electric plant in Saskatchewan. The Conservatives propose, well, the opposite of whatever Trudeau has proposed. They would undo the tanker ban and repeal the Liberals' Bill C-69. That bill brought in new requirements for environmental assessments of major projects, but is highly unpopular with the oil and gas industry, which have lobbied extensively to get rid of it. Also on the topic of regulatory burden, the Conservatives would provide certainty on approval timelines and schedules and end foreign-funded interference in regulatory hearings. It's unclear if that would include silencing oil and gas companies that are foreign-owned. Land, water, wildlife, and ocean conservation. The balance of protecting wildlife and its habitat from human incursion while also allowing for economic activity is a delicate one. More often than not, the needle has gone toward development in Canada to the detriment of endangered species like the southern resident killer whales, most caribou herds, as well as plant species like the whitebark pine. The Trudeau government has made significant progress towards meeting its so-called Aichi biodiversity targets. It pledged to protect 17% of terrestrial area and inland waters and 10% of its oceans by 2020. A flurry of big new protected areas has moved that along. But meanwhile, it has continued to advance some projects, like TMX, and a new road to the Arctic coast that would interfere with sensitive habitat. The Conservatives included in their plan a comprehensive update of Canada's strategy to protect our fisheries, forests, agricultural lands, and tourist areas. That would include a focus on invasive species, which can threaten native ecosystems, and controlling pests that pose a substantial threat to forest and aquatic health, as well as conducting a $15 million inventory of wetlands. As during the Harper years, the language in the Conservative plan favors species and habitats of economic importance over a more holistic approach. It promises to review how land is set aside for protection and whether communities have enough input. The Conservatives continue to support the Aichi targets, which were first agreed to by the Harper government. They also supported the passage of a liberal fisheries bill that restored habitat protections gutted by the Harper government with minor revisions. The centerpiece of the NDP conservation plan is to enshrine the right to a healthy environment in law through what they're calling the Environmental Bill of Rights. It will guarantee the right to clean land, air, and water, and bring in a national freshwater strategy. The NDP is also upping the ante on land protection, whereas the Aichi targets only extend up to 2020. The NDP wants to accelerate the protection of land and protect 30% of land, freshwater, and oceans by 2030. That's nearly double the land and freshwater and triple the amount of ocean protection that the current targets call for. The NDP promises to use all the tools available under the Species at Risk Act, though not to make any changes to it. They say they will work with provinces and territories to protect waterways under international agreements, presumably referring to rivers like the Transborder Elk River, contaminated on the Canadian side by selenium from coal mining. Part of the Greens conservation plan focuses on restoring ecosystems that have been damaged already. They would conduct an inventory of contaminated water bodies and groundwater and work on figuring out how to clean them up, while empowering their own departments and agencies to restore aquatic ecosystems. The Greens would also increase funding to Parks Canada and accelerate the creation of a new marine protected areas and parks with a $500 million completion budget intended to have the entire park system in place by 2030. They would also end trophy hunting across Canada, while supporting other types of hunting, such as indigenous subsistence hunting and hunts of other non-threatened species. Selection of species at risk would no longer be subject to cabinet, but rather to recommendations of scientists. They would increase funding for endangered species and increase penalties for killing them. Each party has taken up their own causes that are related to the environment, but that don't have direct bearing on any one specific target. Among the Liberal Party's side projects has been plastics, a plan to start banning single-use plastics starting around 2021, committing $100 million to reducing plastic waste in developing countries and banning microbeads in cosmetics and other products. The NDP wants to intensify the Liberals' approach to plastics by banning single-use plastics by 2022. They also want to provide training and retraining for people affected by climate action and encourage local food hubs while reducing food waste and protecting pollinator health. The Conservatives, sticking to their push for private solutions to environmental issues, want to issue a green patent credit for eco-friendly technologies. They would modernize air quality regulations. They would also reestablish a policy advisory panel made up of hunters, fishers, and conservation groups. The Greens have a plan to bring in a youth-driven community and environment service corps, which would create 160,000 minimum wage jobs for young people to work in climate mitigation, environmental rehabilitation, and other similar projects across the country. They would also develop laws that will allow non-Canadians to sue Canadian corporations over violations of basic human, environmental, or labor rights in their countries. The environment is a major part of this year's election, and the parties are all going to be jockeying for your vote on this issue, whether it's the Conservatives' industry-led approach, the Liberals' record of restoring protections and establishing new protected areas, the New Democrats' promises to take the Liberal plan even further, or the Greens' promises to make drastic changes. One of these strategies will have to win out. Now, the next thing is taking a look at some of the back and forth and the more specific things that parties are saying about their environmental plans and the counter statements from the other parties on them. First thing is from August 17th of 2018. This is also in the Narwhal. There's also Jamie Thompson. Now, this came around the time that the Trudeau government rolled back their carbon tax reach on industry. What the Trudeau government's scaling back of the carbon tax means. Now, far from the giddy days following the Paris Agreement, Canada's carbon tax has recently run into strong headwinds, despite polling that shows a majority of the public is on board. In the face of these political headwinds, in August 2018, the federal Liberal government proposed to scale back its own commitment to taxing carbon in the name of protecting international competitiveness for heavy emitting industries. What had been a plan to tax 30% of emissions is being rolled back to just 20% for most large emitters. This will mean less incentive for companies to invest in efficient technologies and processes, and less reward for companies that are already ahead of the curve. It almost certainly means more carbon will be emitted, and that Canada's climate goals, committed to under the Paris Accord, will be that much harder to meet. Isabelle Turcotte is the Interim Director of Federal Policy at the Pembina Institute. She says, clearly, competitiveness concerns are re-permeating through every policy conversation these days, and they have been doing so for a little while. The government was somewhat overly cautious here and has given a little more relief than it needed to really mitigate these risks. Central to the new scheme is a system designed to limit the negative impacts on industries that by their nature emit lots of greenhouse gases, such as oil and gas, cement manufacturing, or steel mills. The way this system, the so-called output-based pricing system, will work is somewhat more complex than a single tax on emissions. First, the government will determine the national average emissions intensity for an industry, so the amount of carbon produced per unit of production, say for a barrel of oil. Next, it will set a target level lower than that average. In its draft regulations in January 2018 to make these changes, the government set the level at 70% of the average emissions for most industries. The tax will be applied to any emissions that go above that target. Now, what the government is now proposing is to increase that baseline target, giving industrial sectors more room to pollute without being taxed. Now, imagine 3 steel producers. Company A is emitting 30 kilograms of CO2 for every load of steel it sells. Company B is much less efficient. It produces 60 kilograms. Company C is slightly less efficient than Company A and right on target set by the government. Under the proposed rules, Company B would be taxed on its carbon emissions over the target, while Company A would be generating credits that it could sell to Company B. All 3 have an incentive to reduce their emissions, but only Company B will be paying carbon taxes, similar to cap and trade. The carbon tax plan also sets targets within rather than across industries. That means less carbon-intensive industries won't benefit as much as they would if they were compared directly with big polluters. But cleaner performers within industries, for example, a cleaner oil sands mine, that's a paradox, will get a leg up over a dirtier one. It's one thing to applying the carbon pricing system to ultra-competitive, internationally exposed industries that can't help but produce emissions, like steel. But the new pricing system will also apply to the production of electricity, which Pembina Director Ms. Turcotte said is somewhat awkward. Electricity generation is not emissions intensive by necessity. It's also not exposed to pressure from international markets in the same way as steel or agricultural fertilizers are, meaning it doesn't need the same protection from other countries that don't have carbon prices, like the United States. The reasons for including electricity generation in the system are not entirely clear, although it could prevent an immediate increase in electricity prices for consumers. The reasons may not be clear, but the effects appear easy to predict, namely a slower transition away from fossil fuel electricity. Electrical generation makes up about 10% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, according to the now defunct National Energy Board. Turcotte said the decision to include electrical generation in the output-based pricing system could mean trouble for meeting Paris targets. Turcotte said, "We're concerned by the approach to pricing emissions in the electricity sector and we're not sure how these align with our Paris Agreement targets and to getting to our renewable energy targets as well. It could also mean that less emissions-intensive sectors will have to pick up the slack for the heavier polluters in meeting a national goal. Canada's gap between projected emissions and Paris targets is growing, something the government blamed on a combination of growth in oil and gas and demographic changes, whatever that means. When the Narwhal inquired as to how demographic changes relate to growing emissions, Environment Canada declined to elaborate on what relative contribution oil and gas were expected to make compared to demographics. Again, Ms. Turcotte said, "We have a target as a country, and when a sector is unwilling to take leadership, when it's given all these really enabling conditions with great incentives that actually give them the money to make those investments, it increases the burden on other sectors of our economy and of society." A major concern the federal government says it's trying to address with the new system is the concern that Canadian firms could be put at a disadvantage relative to foreign counterparts who don't have a carbon tax. The way economists see it, a Canadian firm paying more under the carbon tax could lose customers to an American firm that isn't paying for its emissions. If the American firm started producing more while the Canadian one ramped its production down, the total pollution hasn't actually decreased. It's just leaked across the border. Some industrial sectors are both big emitters and are exposed to competition from international trade. Nationally, these sectors amount to only 5% of the economy, but in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's about 18%. Chris Reagan from the Ecofiscal Commission says, to not do anything for these sectors is to increase their costs and then walk away and then let them shrink. The goal of climate policy isn't to reduce emissions by shrinking our economy. The goal is to reduce our emissions by maintaining a healthy economy, but get cleaner. Reagan believes the government's approach to pricing within sectors is the right way to address the problem, and says the changes in the threshold for emissions intensity are pretty small and in a good direction. It is not well enough understood by the public why carbon pricing is economically the best way to do this, relative to the alternatives. If Ottawa proceeds with its draft plan and allows for an 80% threshold for most industries' emissions intensity, Turcotte and Reagan say the next step should involve gradually lowering the cap as other trading partners introduce their own carbon pricing systems. Essentially, this would provide incentive for companies to gradually improve operations or face higher taxes. There is not currently a plan to lower the cap, but an increase in the tax rate itself is built in, from $20 per ton to $50 per ton by 2022. So that's how much the Liberals have blinked on the carbon tax. Now, from September 25th, Andrew Leach, CBC, the Liberals' Climate Balancing Act. The world is watching. For the first time, we're fighting a federal election in which one of the main issues will be the policies the incumbent government has implemented to lower greenhouse gas emissions. Not only will we be arguing about hypothetical future policies and targets, we're going to be litigating existing policies too. And the world will be watching. The closest analog to the position that Justin Trudeau's Liberals find themselves in today is likely that of then Premier Gordon Campbell's BC Liberals in the election of 2009. In that election, held shortly after the Campbell Liberals had introduced the country's first economy-wide carbon price, parties to the left and right of Campbell opposed the carbon tax. The NDP campaigned on an Axe the Tax platform, promising instead a cap-and-trade program and stringent regulations. The Conservatives campaigned on repealing the carbon tax in favor of, well, nothing. In the end, Campbell's Liberals were re-elected, the carbon tax stayed in place, and it still remains in place. Today's circumstances are similar for the federal Liberals. On the left, the Greens and the NDP propose a lot more action on climate change, although we don't have much detail on the policies that will do the heavy lifting to meet ambitious targets. The Conservatives promise far less action on climate change, although they are loath to suggest that this might lead to more emissions. Like fighting a land war in Asia, trying to occupy the middle ground on climate change is almost bound to end badly. By any measure, the policies we've seen introduced over the past 4 years are aggressive, and the Liberals have had to go to war to defend them. They built a policy that worked for collaborative provinces, only to see that spirit of collaboration disappear with the departure of Patrick Brown and the election of Doug Ford and Jason Kenney. They bought a pipeline, but that made nobody happy. The left felt it was a subsidy to oil and gas. The right felt it would not have been needed if only Trudeau had, insert your preferred vaguely defined magic wand waving. And many even see it as an elaborate plan to not build the pipeline at all. While outside forces have hurt the Liberals, they've also hurt themselves. They've undermined their own targets, suggesting more than once that more stringent goals are needed. They've undermined their rationale for carbon pricing, which they've described ad infinitum as the best policy choice for the economy, through more reliance on regulations, like their clean fuel standard and subsidies for electric vehicles. They've been unable to offer a clear vision that reconciles growth in the oil sands, new LNG facilities, and meeting Canada's emission targets. In the 2015 campaign, Trudeau claimed that if we set serious emission targets, then everything else falls into place, and the expansion of the oil sands will be done in a way that doesn't interfere with us meeting our targets. Despite much slower than predicted oil sands growth since 2015, Trudeau still faces a large gap to meet the targets, 79 megatons in the most recent estimates, as his government forecasts that oil sands and LNG production emissions will increase by 29 megatons between now and 2030. So what do? First, resist the urge to commit to a stronger 2030 target. Stacked up against most countries' commitments, Canada's Paris target is already quite stringent. It demands deep cuts relative to business as usual, and our economy is lacking for relatively cheap emissions reductions. Recent work from the International Monetary Fund makes this really clear. With the exception of Australia, Canada's Paris commitment represents the deepest cut relative to what would otherwise be expected to occur among the G20 countries. The IMF also finds that if the G20 implemented Canada's carbon pricing policies, they would collectively exceed their Paris commitments. Others will argue that the world needs to go further than the Paris commitments, and that may be true, but we're not going to get there by consistently moving the goalposts so that ambitious and politically challenging policies quickly become failures. Second, the Liberals need a plan to meet the target they have. To do that, they're going to need the policies they've already announced and some significant new measures. They're also going to people to invest based on their policies, and investors need to know what world they should bet on. Imagine trying to value an emissions-reducing investment when the Liberals tell you they are definitely not going to increase the carbon price beyond $50 per ton unless they do. Mr. Leach put this question directly to a Liberal campaign official, and the answer he got was that the election is about the next 4 years, and the carbon pricing plan for those next 4 years is clear. The price will increase to $50 a ton by 2022, followed by a year to review and reset. At that point, we'll be ready for the next election campaign. The Liberals are correct that current governments cannot bind future governments, but climate change mitigation requires long-term investments, and so the signals we send about new and existing policies matter. When it comes to policies, the Liberals also have a philosophical choice to make. Are they going to double down on carbon pricing or continue to pivot toward more popular but generally more costly policies like regulations and subsidies? Having gone to war for carbon pricing, it would be disappointing to see the Liberals put a lot of weight on policies other than carbon pricing to close the gap for our 2030 targets. Subsidies and regulations might be less politically challenging than carbon pricing, but they'll make the path to our targets more costly for Canadians as a whole. Finally, the Liberals need to deal with the fact that the fights over carbon pricing, pipelines, and the oil sands have divided Canada in a profound way. For years, Alberta's oil industry was asking for a level playing field in emissions policy in which emissions from cars on the 401 would face the same treatment as emissions from the oil sands. They got it, almost to the letter. But Alberta also got other things: a tanker ban on BC's north coast, stalled pipelines, and a new untested regulatory regime at a time of uncertainty in the industry. This has led to a rise in energy nationalism that the Trudeau government needs to counter. On the other hand, Canadians concerned about climate change can count a national carbon price, accelerated coal phase-out, and a national clean fuel standard as significant progress. However, they've also got a government-owned oil sands pipeline and are staring down a big gap to our national targets at a time when concern over climate change is increasing and oil sands emissions continue to grow. Perhaps there's a way for Trudeau to reconcile these two solitudes. Trudeau needs to stop apologizing for Canada and make our emissions policies a point of pride for our energy sector. What do the loud voices want? Climate policy that affects emissions in the United States, China, and India at the same rate as it applies in Canada. They're not wrong to want that. What do environmentalists want? Policies sufficiently stringent to meet global goals. Also not wrong. To that end, I hope we'll see Trudeau frame the issue not as Canada needing to do more, but as the world needing to catch up to Canada's policy. What would happen if globally we had a $50 per ton carbon price, a phase out of coal-fired electricity by 2030, a clean fuel standard equivalent to that proposed for Canada, and global subsidies for electric vehicles at the rates proposed by the Trudeau Liberals? We'd have a vastly different global energy system, and we'd be on track or close to on track to meet global climate change goals. You don't hear that nearly often enough from Trudeau and the Liberals. Trudeau also needs to get Canadians to place their bets. The Conservatives are promising a world with increasing demand for Canadian fossil fuels, an implicit bet on less stringent climate policies worldwide than those needed to meet climate goals. Trudeau has to convince Canadians that's the wrong horse. If the world is acting on climate change, meeting our own targets will be much easier, since the demand pull on fossil fuel extraction will diminish, while the global technology push will accelerate. If the world is not acting aggressively, Canada's policy path becomes harder, more expensive, and fraught with competitiveness concerns. When Canadians vote on October 21st, the results will have global implications for climate policy. If Trudeau's government falls, it will be chalked up as yet another electoral defeat for action on climate change. Trudeau's climate platform needs to make the case for his policies to Canadians. And if it fails to do so effectively, it will have implications far beyond Canada's borders. Interesting. Now, June 27th, Sarah Cox, former guest in the Narwhal. How real is Andrew Scheer's real plan to tackle climate change? It's 11,000 words on 60 pages, teams with glossy color photographs, and begins with a request to consider the environment before printing this document. In the middle of June, Federal Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer released a real plan to protect our environment, billed as a blueprint for reducing Canada's greenhouse gas emissions and strengthening environmental protections without taking money out of Canadians' pockets. An accompanying video featured Scheer strolling along a forested path in Stanley Park, telling viewers, climate change is a global problem requiring a global solution, and taking aim at the Trudeau government's tax grab, the much-maligned carbon tax. The Conservative Environment Plan, Scheer explained, focuses on big polluters, not commuters, and technology, not taxes. Catchy phrases aside, what exactly do those 60 pages say? And how realistic is Scheer's real plan? Well, the plan has 3 planks: green technology, not taxes; a cleaner and greener natural environment, and taking the climate change fight global. The green technology section expands on Scheer's favorite bugbear, failed Trudeau carbon tax. The plan says the carbon tax has failed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, pointing out that Canada is falling behind in meeting its Paris Agreement pledge. The carbon tax hasn't worked in British Columbia, Scheer told Global News. Emissions went up and it stopped being revenue neutral. But UBC political science professor Catherine Harrison said peer-reviewed studies show BC's carbon tax has reduced consumption of transportation and home heating fuels and increased purchases of fuel-efficient vehicles. The studies also show the tax has not harmed economic competitiveness. Professor Harrison says there's lots of good evidence that the carbon tax has reduced BC's emissions below what they would have been. But it is still the case that BC's emissions have only leveled off. Notably, that's before a huge spike in BC emissions from the LNG Canada project. A revenue-neutral tax means that all of the revenue earned via the tax is returned to taxpayers via other tax cuts and rebates. In BC's case, the carbon tax was originally offset with equivalent decreases in corporate and personal income taxes, as well as a new tax credit for low-income earners. But those tax cuts have not kept pace with steady carbon tax increases, meaning that BC's carbon tax is no longer revenue neutral. Instead of a carbon tax, Scheer's climate plan puts many of his eggs in a green technology basket, a green home tax credit, a green patent credit, a green technology and innovation fund, and a green hub for innovators are among a flurry of promises. But the plan sidesteps the math, failing to provide estimates of how much Canada's emissions would drop with all of those goodies. Harrison also says, I think it is a plan that is designed to appeal to a subset of voters who want to be convinced that Canada can step up and do its part without actually doing anything. It's devoid of detail. The plan would set emissions targets for major emitters, defined as companies that emit more than 40 kilotons of carbon a year, down from the current 50 kilotons. Companies that exceed limits would be required to invest a set amount of money for every excess ton in what Scheer called homegrown emissions-reducing technologies, which he said could then be shared with the world's highest emitting countries to lower global emissions. But once again, there are no estimates of how much Canada's emissions would drop with the new targets, no analysis explaining why the plan really is Canada's best chance to meet the Paris targets, as Scheer claims, and only a vague, trust me assertion that future green technology developed in Canada will reduce global emissions. Harrison added, at this time, we need political leaders who are going to put forward more detail and make the case to voters for what their plan can accomplish, what it's going to cost, and why their plan is better than the other parties. And I don't think the Scheer plan has done that. The cleaner and greener natural environment section of the plan claims the Conservatives will protect air, water, land, and wildlife. But again, the devil is in the details, and the details are scant. There is no mention of a ban on single-use plastics, for instance. In June of this year, the Trudeau government announced a ban on single-use plastics, which could include straws, cutlery, and bags, starting in 2021 at the earliest. And the plan says only that Scheer will prioritize funding for environmental compliance and enforcement of Canada's environmental laws. It makes no mention of repealing Bill C-69, legislation vociferously opposed by the Conservatives. The bill revamps Canada's environmental laws after they were gutted by the former Conservative government. A Scheer government would lead a conservation assessment to identify the best opportunities for expanding our protected area network, including parks, marine protected areas, national wildlife areas, and migratory bird sanctuaries. Canmore-based scientist Laura Corristine said she did a double take when she read about plans for a conservation assessment. It's a nice aspirational statement, said Corristine, whose research focuses on biodiversity and climate change. But it slows down the process. It's like reinventing the wheel. It simply says we're going to go back to where we were 5 years ago and do it all again. In May 2018, Corstein and 16 other Canadian and international scholars sent a policy brief to Scheer, other opposition leaders, Federal Environment Minister Catherine McKenna, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, outlining how Canada can prioritize the protection of areas with the greatest potential to reduce biodiversity loss. A huge amount of work on identifying the best opportunities for designing additional protected areas also occurred through the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process, which includes the Aichi goals, a new approach to conservation in Canada that aims to meet a commitment under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. The commitment requires signatory countries to legally designate 17% of land and inland waters as protected areas exposed to industrial activity. Now, as of 2017, Canada had protected a mere 10.6% of its land and inland waters, compared to 54% in Venezuela, 30% in Brazil, and 17% in Australia. The Conservatives' plan promises $15 million over 3 years to complete a national wetland inventory and to study the feasibility of an incentives-based program to protect critical wetland habitats. It also says the Conservatives will protect migratory birds, but only mentions waterfowl in the context of hunting them, and omits any details about how a Scheer government would tackle the country's growing number of at-risk species. More than 600 plant and animal species are listed under the Federal Species at Risk Act, with many more listed in individual provinces and territories. Corstein adds, the loss of species, loss of biodiversity, wildlife that is disappearing from our landscape, that is a huge and fundamental issue that Canada needs to address. To not reference it is problematic. An action plan should really be about what we are going to do. And then there's taking the fight against climate change global, a euphemism for sidestepping responsibility for our own carbon emissions. The world needs more Canadian energy, says a T-shirt on a man chatting with Scheer in a photo. Another photo features Scheer watering a tree he has planted at a refinery in Jamnagar, India. At the end of the day, if there are increased CO2 measures in other countries, we don't do the world any favors. Molecules of CO2 don't have passports. They don't worry about borders. Let's realize that if we bring in a carbon tax and chase away jobs and investment, only to see that pop up in other countries, we're not going to do the planet a favor. The Conservative plan states that Canadian energy can be used to replace dirtier foreign energy sources, pointing out that natural gas, such as LNG, is a cleaner source of fuel than coal. By promoting LNG, we can support a key driver of the Canadian economy and reduce global emissions at the same time. Oh, bullshit. UBC Professor Harrison said the argument is very selective because it picks the cleaner fossil fuel, not the dirtier fossil fuels that we're currently exploiting in great quantities. It's also a problematic argument because the fact is that the Paris Agreement, as it's currently written, assigns responsibility to the countries in which the emissions occur. There's also much debate about whether LNG is indeed cleaner than coal when methane emissions from fracking and liquefaction are added to the equation. As for the Canadian technology and products that will ratchet down greenhouse gas emissions in other countries, which the Conservatives would brand as Clean Canada, the plan states that Canada is a global leader in carbon capture and storage technology. It posits that if China fitted just 100 of its 3,000 coal plants with carbon capture and storage, it can eliminate the equivalent of nearly half of the emissions produced by Canada's entire economy. Yet, CCS experiments in Canada have been uneconomical, and the future of such technology is highly uncertain. Professor Harrison said it would be prudent for Canada to start to transition its economy away from fossil fuels and towards lower carbon industries, so we will be less vulnerable as other countries move away from fossil fuels. Given the Conservatives' focus on economic considerations, There's lots of economic modeling that suggests that the economic benefits of action on climate change outweigh the costs. So not exactly a ringing endorsement there. It's from August 12th. Andrew Leach, CBC. Conservative climate plan is cloaked in mystery and choked with irony. It took Andrew Scheer over a year from the time he first promised a climate change plan to deliver one so cloaked in mystery and choked with irony that perhaps few would notice a subtle change. Last April, he said without hesitation that, of course, his plan would allow Canada to meet its Paris commitments first made by the Harper government. Now he'll say only that his plan gives Canada the best chance to meet those targets. I suppose he can claim his plan has a chance to meet the targets because he hasn't defined many of the measures he's going to take very clearly. With that much wiggle room, there exists a theoretical chance he could do something stringent enough to meet Paris. I guess Scheer's plan tells you what he won't do. No carbon taxes, no clean fuel standards, and generally nothing that costs anyone anything. What the plan doesn't tell you is how he plans to square all of this with Canada's Paris targets and or prepare Canada for success in a world acting on climate change. True to his previous commitments, Scheer announced that he wouldn't price carbon, sort of. Instead, he'd demand that facilities invest a specified amount, call it a tax, to offset any emissions above a cap that he would impose. A requirement to financially compensate for emissions sounds a lot like a carbon tax, just a tax that we know almost nothing about. We know that a Scheer government would set emission standards for major emitters, specifically facilities emitting over 40,000 tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and that facilities would be required to reduce their emissions to meet those unspecified limits. We're told those limits will reflect the higher standards of green technology, and that those who emit more than is allowed will be required to invest in research, development, and the adoption of emissions-reducing technology. Facilities will have to invest a set amount for every ton of emissions above the limit, but we don't know what these limits are or what the required investment rates will be. If any of this sounds ambitious and likely to make a real dent in emissions, you need only look as far as Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's reaction to understand it likely won't. If Scheer were serious about making big cuts to industrial emissions, the loudest objections would likely come from Kenney. About 55% of the emissions covered under Scheer's proposed industrial regulations would be in Alberta, with most of those in the energy sector. A federal plan to require emissions reductions in Alberta's energy sector with mandated but unspecified investments in technology for those who don't meet the highest standards. Such a statement made by Prime Minister Trudeau would have Jason Kenney foaming with outrage and talking about how the measures could force Alberta out of Confederation. Instead, crickets. One need not wonder why. Kenney is confident that the plan would not be sufficiently stringent to disrupt the status quo in Alberta's energy sector. This leads to one of the major unaddressed issues in Scheer's plan. How would it interact with provincial plans? Would Scheer's industrial regulations apply everywhere, or would they act as a federal backstop in jurisdictions without sufficiently stringent policies? The latter approach would present more than a little irony, as Canada's Conservative premiers are in court arguing that the federal government does not have the authority to enact such a backstop plan. Scheer also tries to spin his plan as being more stringent than Trudeau's. It's not. We're told that the program would apply to facilities emitting more than 40 kilotons per year, while Trudeau's plan applies only to facilities emitting more than 50. But this is a false comparison. Under Trudeau's plan, smaller facilities are covered by the carbon tax. Under Scheer's plan, all but the largest 600 or so facilities in Canada would be exempted from carbon emission reduction standards or pricing. Not content with that, Scheer's plan has the audacity to claim that the biggest polluters got a special deal under Trudeau's policy, as they only pay a carbon price on emissions above a facility-specific limit. Scheer's plan has those deals too. It requires firms to invest a certain amount to offset emissions above a facility-specific limit. The real difference is that with Scheer's plan, nobody knows how big the special deals will be. The Scheer plan talks of technology, not taxes, as the solution to Canada's emission challenges, and in so doing, creates a false dichotomy. The question is not whether technology will play a key role in reducing emissions, as it necessarily must, but how to accelerate development and deployment of these new technologies. Carbon pricing, whether in the form of taxes or so-called flexible regulations, will provide higher value to low-carbon innovations and encourage exactly the development and deployment that Scheer himself wishes to see occur. Don't believe that economic incentives will drive innovation? Andrew Scheer certainly does, as his plan offers a 20% refundable credit for home renovations up to a maximum value of $3,800 per year, a $250 million fund to subsidize private sector investments in green technology, a reduced federal corporate tax rate applied to revenue from green patents, and expanded Export Development Canada programs to issue more green bonds. Noticeably absent, however, is any acknowledgement that economists agree that a carbon price is the best means to encourage green technology deployment because it ensures that a market exists for emissions reductions. As economists Jack Mintz and Nancy Ohlweiler wrote in their seminal paper on emissions pricing in Canada, an environmental tax provides a continuous incentive to search for ways to minimize emissions. It is in the interest of the taxpayer to continue to search for better and cheaper technologies to reduce taxed emissions. Scheer proposes to brand Canadian energy products Canadian Clean and market them as an alternative to more carbon-intensive options elsewhere. This branding exercise, it seems, is unburdened by the inconvenient fact that many of our energy exports are more carbon-intensive than potential alternatives. Take, for example, our oil exports to the U.S. West Coast. In 2018, the average carbon intensity for crude supplied to California refineries was roughly 70 kilograms of carbon per barrel, while the weighted average of Canadian barrels exported to California was approximately 100 kilograms per barrel, more than 40% higher than the average. Would Scheer's commitment to replace high emissions energy sources with lower alternatives extend to Canada's oil sands exports? Of course not. There are examples of Canadian energy and energy-intensive exports that are cleaner than global alternatives. Aluminum produced using Quebec hydroelectricity or LNG from BC, likely among them. But when it comes to Canadian oil, this strategy seems destined to see Scheer hoisted by his own bitumen-soaked petard. Opponents of Canadian oil sands would, no doubt, embrace a Canadian campaign to displace emissions-intensive energy sources. And while there are doubtless many environmental campaigns featuring pictures of oil sands mines overlaid with Scheer's Canadian Clean slogan, it seems like an own goal they should strive to avoid. Beyond the "I can't believe it's not a carbon tax" on industrial emissions, tax credits, and marketing gimmicks, we're told that Scheer will encourage things, but not how these encouragements will change anyone's decisions. For example, Scheer's plan states that farmers are doing their part in the fight against climate change by improving land use practices like zero tillage and the use of 4R nutrient stewardship. Farmers might be pleased that Scheer will recognize their contribution in sequestering carbon, but I'm sure they'd be much happier with a carbon offset program which would allow farmers to earn revenue stream from their activities to complement their cost savings. Such programs have been in place in Alberta since 2007, and the Harper government had proposed the development of a federal offset program around the same time. That program would be a good place for a Scheer government to make good on its claim to look for ways to support their continued development of technology and land use practices. Instead, we're left to wonder what persuasive words Scheer might use to encourage agricultural emission reductions. Remember, removing the federal price on carbon could actually make some of these emissions reductions less bankable for farmers. Mr. Leach is not impressed. Let's move on to the Greens. This is from the Canadian Press, Amir Rabson, May 27th. Greens call for ban on foreign oil imports, using Alberta oil instead. Green Party leader Elizabeth May says saving the world from climate change requires Canada to get off oil before the middle of the century. In the meantime, she wants Canada off foreign oil as soon as possible. The promise to make Canada energy independent is perhaps unexpectedly in line with the economic and climate strategy of Conservative leader Andrew Scheer. Scheer's plan calls for Canada to import no foreign oil by 2030, partly by planning an energy corridor across Canada that could simplify the construction of pipelines able to move Alberta oil to any coast. He sees it as a way to find additional domestic markets for Canada's oil sands in a bid to increase their production. May's plan to turn off the taps to oil imports is only a stopgap measure to keep foreign oil out until Canada can break its oil habit altogether. By 2050, May wants bitumen to be used in Canada only by the petrochemical industry for plastics, rubber, paint, and other such products. May's climate plan is likely to get more scrutiny than its predecessors in past elections. The Green Climate Plan also calls for Canada to double its cuts to greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and get emissions to zero by 2050. That plan includes no longer selling combustion engine cars after 2030 and replacing all existing combustion engine vehicles by 2040. Canada imports about 1 million barrels of oil a day and produces 4 times that much. In 2017, Canada produced an average 4.2 million barrels of oil a day and exported 3.3 million of it. Domestic refineries took the rest. Canada's oil producers already pump enough product to meet domestic demand, but there are 2 problems. There is no pipeline from the oil-rich west to refineries in the east, and even if there were, those refineries aren't equipped to handle the heavier bitumen that is the Alberta oil sands trademark. For Canadian refineries in the east, bitumen from the oil sands must be upgraded to synthetic crude. May's plan is to invest in upgraders to do it. She acknowledges weaning Canada off foreign oil won't happen overnight, given existing contracts Canadian refineries have, and figuring out how to build the upgraders and then ship the product. Gee, is that all? Privately, Liberal government critics suggest there is no way to have Canada's East Coast use Canadian oil without building a new pipeline to get the products there. May does not support a new pipeline anywhere and argues the raw bitumen could be transferred by rail as long as Canada invests more in its rail services. The proposed Energy East pipeline to carry diluted bitumen to the East Coast fell apart in 2017, in part because of low oil prices, but also amid significant opposition in Quebec, opposition that continues under the Coalition Avenir Quebec government. May said the Greens are the only party that have a plan that allows human civilization to survive. Well, what does Mr. Leach have to say about the Greens' plan? This is from July 29th. Greens' climate plan adds up to mission improbable. It's summer, so we can all likely be forgiven for not paying attention to plans and early platform commitments in the lead up to the fall election. One of those plans, the Mission Possible climate change plan from the Green Party, merits more critical attention than it's getting. What drew my attention to it was the publication of a transcript of the interview the Green Party leader Elizabeth May did with Maclean's Paul Wells in Ottawa. A few things in the interview rubbed me the wrong way, not least of which was the implication that the policies that many of us have been working on for years amounted to little or nothing. After tweeting a little too much about this interview and the plan itself, I also had the opportunity to chat with May, and some of her comments to me are reflected here as well. It's certainly to the credit of the Greens that they reached out, not just at the policy level, but also with a phone call from the leader to clarify their plans. Mission Possible proposes a radical transformation of Canada's economy in a frighteningly short period of time. Beyond the scope and scale of Mission Possible, the regional disparity of the likely impacts is remarkable. Let's be clear. If the world is to act on climate change in sufficient measure to meet global goals, we're going to need a lot of transformation quickly. The IPCC reported recently that keeping the global temperature increase below 1.5 degrees would likely require a decline in global emissions of about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. The Green Plan gives a sense of the order of magnitude of the transitions we'd need to see if we're going to meet aggressive global goals. For that, they deserve credit. However, the plan leaves far too many loose ends, includes far too many inconsistencies, and offhand near impossible adoption rates for retrofits and renewable power. And it doesn't say a lot about how these actions will spur similar kinds of cuts globally, so as to benefit from reduced impacts of climate change. If you're going to address emissions in Canada, you first need to know where they come from. It's become fashionable in conservative circles to point at heavy industry as the source of Canada's emissions, while exempting from scrutiny emissions from chimneys and tailpipes. Polluters, not commuters, to borrow from Doug Ford. Elizabeth May makes a bit of the same mistake in her conversation with Wells when she says first that there are basically 200 facilities across Canada that are responsible for the lion's share of greenhouse gases. In fact, the 200 largest industrial facilities account for about 32% of national emissions. A significant share, but not the lion's share by any means. If you want an accurate summary by sector, oil and gas production, 27%, transportation, 24%, buildings, 11%, and electricity, 10%, account for about 75% of emissions, with other heavy industry at 10%, agriculture at 10%, waste disposal at 6%, making up the rest. Provincially, Alberta dominates with 38% of national emissions, and the top 5 emitting provinces account for 91% of emissions combined. To reduce emissions from oil and gas, the Greens plan pledges to ban oil imports and fracking, to eliminate not clearly defined subsidies, and to continue carbon pricing. May also alludes to stringent regulations on emissions-intensive sources in her interview with Wells, though that's not reflected in the published plan. Frankly, Mr. Leach says he'd have expected to see stronger leave-it-in-the-ground language, but it's not there. There's a throwaway about transitioning the oil sands to supply only petrochemical facilities by 2050, but that's it. The lack of a clear oil sands policy is surprising, given that oil sands production alone accounts for more than 10% of Canada's emissions. Banning oil imports has the potential to create chaos with no clear emissions impact. Canada imports a lot of crude, much of it to supply refineries in eastern Canada. How are you going to replace or eliminate demand for those barrels? In her interview with Wells, May talks about using Newfoundland oil, but using currently exported Newfoundland oil will still leave eastern Canada short, about 400,000 barrels a day. Perhaps the Greens expect some refineries to close? If they do, they should say so. Otherwise, the options to keep them open include more pipeline capacity from the west or continued tanker-borne imports. And if you're just shifting barrels around and shipping some barrels further than you otherwise would, you're not reducing emissions. We also currently import a lot of hydrocarbon liquids to dilute oil sands bitumen production for shipping via pipelines. Again, clarity is needed here. If we're not going to import diluent, then what? Perhaps in line with Elizabeth May's previous statements, we could upgrade or partially upgrade more bitumen in Alberta. This would reduce the need for diluent, but to offset our imports, a major processing increase would be needed, and this would increase both emissions in Alberta and in total. It seems odd that a Green Party would be behind tens of billions of dollars in heavy oil refining capacity, especially in a North American market that is already oversupplied with refined products. There's a lot of contradiction here, since Mission Probable states that it would allow investment in upgraders and presumably full conversion refineries, in line with previous statements from May. Yet, in clarifying comments to Mr. Leach, Ms. May stated that there is no need for new pipelines and no support for new fossil fuel infrastructure. That leaves a pretty gaping hole that needs to be addressed. Electricity would also be in for dramatic changes under the Greens plan. They pledged to remove all fossil fuel generation by 2030. Nationally, about 20% of our generation comes from coal and natural gas, with a little bit from oil. Stated that way, it sounds manageable. But fossil fuel sources make up more than 85% of the generation in Alberta, over 80% in Saskatchewan, and more than 50% in Nova Scotia. Furthermore, natural gas plants also often serve as peaking plants, supplying the grid only during periods of peak demand. They are therefore both relatively low generators and crucial to overall system reliability. Replacing all of that in 10 years, when electricity is a provincial jurisdiction? How? The answer, I'm told, lies in the plan's proposal to rebuild and revamp our east-west electricity grid. Interties, the connections that allow current to pass between separate electricity utility systems, are indeed crucial to increasing the use of renewable power. But constructing substantial interprovincial interties in 10 years is a challenge, let alone construction at a scale sufficient to offset mothballed fossil fuel generation in some regional markets. And because you never want to have a single point of failure, jurisdictions would need to have either peaking power plants or immediately droppable demand to offset imports in case there's a line failure. This is precisely the capability we are significantly reducing by phasing out gas plants. While the electricity supply side is undergoing upheaval, the Green Plan would also radically increase electricity demand by electrifying transportation and building energy use. The plan pledges to ensure that all new cars are electric by 2030 and that by 2040, all internal combustion vehicles are off the road. This seems like a lot, but it's a path less aggressive than the one Norway is currently following. And with the speed at which range is increasing and cost is decreasing for electric vehicles, it's plausible. Meeting these targets would increase electricity in demand likely by 5 to 10%. Again, this is significant but manageable in and of itself. The plan leaves open the question of heavier duty vehicles, where the electrification challenges get much larger. But then things get really serious. The plan calls for retrofitting every building in Canada to be carbon neutral by 2030. Every building in Canada in 10 years. Canada has more than 14 million private dwellings, and in every province but Quebec and New Brunswick, more than half of average household energy consumption comes from natural gas or heating oil. And you've got commercial and industrial buildings on top of that. You can get part of the way to carbon neutrality with renewable natural gas, but you're going to have to electrify a lot of the heating and hot water systems and make sure that electricity is carbon neutral to meet this goal. And you're going to need a whole lot more electricity to do that. And we haven't even considered how we're going to replace industrial heat currently provided by on-site combined heat and power systems fueled by natural gas. Never mind the mind-boggling logistics and costs of deep retrofits to Canada's entire building stock. In conversation with Mr. Leach, May compared the effort involved to the rescue of British forces at Dunkirk in World War II. She may be underestimating the challenge. The combined electricity demand changes would likely mean upgrades to most local distribution systems at a time when we're undertaking an unprecedented revamp of our electricity supply and a major investment in transmission. How's it all going to get paid for? And how would the federal government mitigate the massive regional differences in the cost of these policies? And I'll remind you again, electricity and the building stock are both provincial jurisdiction. Perhaps we'll see more in the lead up to the election, but today this remains more of a wish list than a plan. And he speaks of the PBO report, which did come out after that article. Let's move on to the NDP, again from Mr. Leach. This is from September 13th in CBC. NDP climate plan tries and fails to carve out middle ground. Let's be honest. Who among us would not like to commute to work in a canoe? NDP leader Jagmeet Singh looks like he's doing just that on the cover of the NDP's Power to Change website. The website and the accompanying more detailed climate plan both contain multiple veiled references to the Green New Deal plan put forward by New York congressional representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and are meant to evoke the same types of emotion and symbolism. It's even in the web address, climate and jobs. Will it deliver? The NDP plan carves out a middle ground between commitments to policies that might meet Canada's 2030 targets from the Liberals and the wildly ambitious platform of the Green Party. Singh's plan, though, is riddled with inconsistencies and short on details, and where details are given, the policies simply aren't stringent enough to meet the goals. The NDP plan highlights 9 areas for action, of which 6 are related to reducing emissions. In addition to setting new emissions targets, the NDP proposes a program of job creation through clean energy adoption, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, energy efficiency retrofits for buildings, cleaner transit, subsidies for zero-emissions vehicles, and more involvement of Indigenous peoples in climate action. There are also commitments related to single-use plastics, climate adaptation, and the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. Let's start with their targets. With all of the policies proposed to date by the governing Liberals, and notwithstanding potential reductions in the stringency of policies in Alberta and Ontario, we're on track for emissions of about 592 megatons by 2030, well above our Paris target of 513 megatons. The NDP plan sets a much deeper target. They claim with little evidence that their policies will reduce our emissions to 450 megatons by 2030, and then add a statement that they plan to do more. The monumental task of reducing national emissions by 38% in 10 years is described as an important first step, and they plan to add more measures to drive emissions down by a further 50 to 80 megatons, according to calculations based on statements in the plan. We're just not told what those measures might be. How exactly? That's not clear. How is the NDP going to take this monumental first step? We're not told much about that either. The plan states that the NDP will continue carbon pricing, including rebates to households that fall under the federal backstop plan, while making it fairer and rolling back the brakes the Liberals have given to the big polluters. We're not told what the carbon price will be, just that there will continue to be one. Interestingly, later in the plan, the NDP has its own brakes for big polluters, although they call them a low-carbon industrial strategy, which will include a fund that industrial operators, like manufacturers, can apply to in order to access support for investments in lowering emissions and keeping jobs here in Canada. This will also be complemented with a $3 billion climate bank that would provide loans to spur investment in green technology. The plan tells us that workers most impacted by the changes in our economy will not pay the price of action on climate change. Here, they draw on the work of the Task Force on Just Transition for Canadian coal power workers and communities, but managing a broad economic transition on the scale proposed by the NDP is an entirely different proposition than managing the impact of closing 14 coal power stations over 15 years. If you're not going to protect some of Canada's emissions-intensive sectors from competitiveness impacts, as the existing output-based pricing system applied to industrial emissions does, you're talking about much more significant worker displacement still. What about the oil and gas sector? Of course, what Mr. Leach refers to is the Blue-Green Canada effort, along with government and unions and communities, that has really been active here in Alberta with the phase-out of coal plants that are basically the, by far, majority employer in towns. It's been hard for a town of 8,000 people to figure this out, never mind doing it across the country. First, the plan states that where oil and gas will continue to form a part of Canada's energy mix in the immediate future, we will continue to prioritize domestic upgrading and refining instead of shipping our raw resources and jobs to other countries. Does that mean new upgraders and refineries? Keeping the ones we have? Reducing production and export at the same time? If so, how? We're left to wonder. Mr. Leach was shocked that the plan didn't even mention the oil sands, Canada's fastest growing source of emissions. Although it does mention bitumen once. The plan also commits to eliminating oil and gas subsidies, claiming that Canada spends $3.3 billion per year on oil and gas subsidies, and that the federal government purchased the Trans Mountain Oil Pipeline for a staggering $4.5 billion, and that the government gave another $1.6 billion in handouts to the oil patch. These claims are worth unpacking because they're mostly smoke and mirrors. Now, the $3.3 billion comes from a 2015 version of an IISD study, which is pretty dated when you consider how much has happened in oil and gas since then. The up-to-date estimates from the same study group are smaller, with only about $380 million worth of federal subsidies on their list. Most of the subsidies in the original and up-to-date studies are attributed to the Alberta and BC governments, resource royalties, taxes, research grants, and the like. If saying thinks the federal government can affect these policies, Sections 92 and 92A of the Constitution may have something to say about it. What about the $1.6 billion in handouts? That's where it gets interesting. These were funds announced last year to, among other things, support investments in green technology and environmental efficiency. In other words, the same types of investments envisioned by the NDP's own proposed multi-billion-dollar climate bank and low-carbon industrial strategy. Are we to understand that the NDP would not allocate any of these dollars to reduce emissions in the oil and gas sector? Or that similar investments made by the NDP would not count as subsidies or handouts for some reason? As for Trans Mountain, the government did buy the pipeline for $4.5 billion, but this can't be seen as a direct subsidy, since the government also received the assets in return. Arguably, the pipeline expansion would not have been underwritten by any private sector company, but even so, the lion's share of the purchase price was not for the expansion, but for the existing pipeline and infrastructure. Interestingly, the plan doesn't say what an NDP government would do with the pipeline, although presumably divestiture or outright cancellation would be on the list. It's not clear in the plan how much the NDP expects these reductions in so-called subsidies to reduce emissions. What's certainly clear is that there are not billions of dollars worth of new dollars available to the federal government if federal oil and gas tax expenditures and other programs are canceled. The rest of the NDP plan for emissions reduction centers on three key commitments to buildings, greening transit and personal transportation, and emissions-free electricity. The NDP sets a target of retrofitting all housing stock in Canada by 2050, with half of those retrofits completed by 2030. Half the homes in the country getting some sort of improvement by 2030 is ambitious in and of itself, but we're only told that homeowners would be able to access low-interest loans repayable through energy savings to cover upgrades like insulation, windows, heat pumps, and other renewable technology. Interest rates are already very low, so you're going to have to do a lot more than offer a low-interest loan, which would still likely have a higher rate than a mortgage or home equity secured line of credit, to get people to do a lot of things they would not already do to reduce emissions. On electricity, the NDP will set a target to power Canada with net carbon-free electricity by 2030 and move to 100% non-emitting electricity by 2050. As with the Green Party plan, this doesn't sound that ambitious at the national level, but regionally, it's near impossible. We're not told much about the road from target to reality. There's talk of the new Canadian Climate Bank, but new investment isn't the issue. If you're talking about a near-complete phase-out of fossil fuel power in 10 years, you're going to need a big regulatory hammer or a much higher carbon price. And supposing you were able to do that, you're going to need a massive increase in intertie capacity, storage, and alternative dispatchable electricity sources. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible to power many parts of the country when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. On vehicles, the plan is also quite ambitious in goals, but without a lot of detail on policies. Where there are details, there are also concerns. The plan promises federal purchase incentives and federal sales tax exemptions for working families on zero-emission vehicle purchases. I'm not sure how that means testing is actually going to work. Do retired people then not qualify? These federal incentives will grow in value to $15,000 and be targeted to made-in-Canada vehicles only. This is, of course, likely to run afoul of our free trade agreements, while also being a very regressive and costly policy. We know that historically, a significant share of electric or hybrid vehicle subsidies have been paid to those who, A, would have purchased EVs anyway, and B, are in the higher end of the income distribution. If you walked into an NDP policy convention and pitched a policy that would hand out $15,000 checks predominantly to the most well-off households and nothing to those who can't afford to buy a new car, how well do you think that policy would go over? Somehow, subsidies for electric vehicles always seem to escape the same type of scrutiny. Transportation and transit is the biggest line item in the plan at $6.5 billion. But when you consider that we have more than 20 million light-duty vehicles on the roads in Canada, you're going to need a lot more than that to drive a large-scale conversion of Canada's fleet on subsidies alone, without additional regulations or, again, carbon prices. Now, Professor Leach was deeply critical of the Green Plan for pitching outcomes that, in many cases, were technically infeasible, and of the Conservative Plan for promising more reductions from demonstrably weakened and or undefined policies. The NDP fits in the middle of those two. They offer targets which are, for the most part, at least technically feasible, but they don't offer the policy horsepower to get there. Many of the policies they do identify might be popular, but they simply won't generate the levels of emission reductions promised. Now, I'm going to look at something from Simon Donner that was in Policy Options, policyoptions.irpp.org. This is from October 1st. This is just a little statement in case you're asking this question, which you should be. Here's the answer. No party's climate plan will avoid dangerous global warming levels. To understand the implications for Canada and our coming election, we can use data straight out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report from 2018. The IPCC has been able to estimate how much carbon the world has left to burn for a chance at avoiding different levels of warming, and each country's share of that carbon budget. The key challenge is deciding how much of that budget each country should have. Should it be based on a country's present-day emissions? Wealthy, high-emitting countries like Canada would have more carbon to burn and leave little left for the developing world. For example, following that logic, the United States, Europe, Japan, and China would alone consume the entire carbon budget for a 1.5-degree rise, leaving nothing for the rest of the world. It's not a tenable approach to dividing responsibility. The most equitable solution is to divide the carbon budget based on population. This way, Canada receives a smaller portion, 0.5%, but provides a more realistic pathway for the rest of the world. Using this approach, Mr. Donner has calculated future CO2 emissions trajectories compatible with Canada's remaining carbon budget for a 2/3 chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, and 4 degrees, using the various party platforms and estimates for emissions in the year 2030. Now, there is a picture of that in the show slideshow on the show page. According to this analysis, for Canada to do its fair share to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, our emissions would need to decrease 96 to 99% below current levels by 2030. The sharp drop may look shocking, but it is no surprise to climate experts. The world has already warmed by over 1 degree, and there's little time left to prevent the additional 0.5 degree. Avoiding 1.5 degrees centigrade of global warming is mathematically possible, but not at all realistic without the development and rapid deployment of technologies to pull carbon dioxide out of the air. The 2-degree global warming trajectories for Canada are roughly in line with the Liberal government's recent proposal to reach net zero emissions by 2050. These trajectories require a 61 to 67% decrease in emissions by 2030. Achieving that goal would be unrealistic without substantial reductions from the major emitting sectors of the economy, oil and gas and transportation. For example, it's hard to reconcile the approval of any multi-decade infrastructure, like pipelines or new mining operations, with these trajectories. If oil sands emissions are permitted to reach Alberta's proposed limit of 100 megatons, that sector would alone represent 36 to 42% of Canada's total 2030 target, up from the 11% today. Canada's current and proposed federal policies lie within the range of what's necessary to avoid 3 degrees of global warming when using modeling from Environment and Climate Change Canada, submitted to the UN. These policies are not sufficient to meet the federal target of a 30% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer has said his party would stick to the existing federal target, but the Conservative Party's climate plan document, which contains neither carbon pricing nor regulations, will place Canada in the range of a 4-degree or more greenhouse gas emissions trajectory. This finding draws from a modeling study by economist Mark Jacquard, described in Policy Options, which estimates that the Conservative plan would lead to a 2% increase in emissions from 2015 to 2030. The estimated 2030 emissions are similar to that of Environment and Climate Change Canada's scenario of without any policies, which it included in its submission to the UN. A separate study by Enviroeconomics estimates a 13% decrease by 2030 under the Conservative plan, in the range of a 3 to 4 degree warming trajectory. The NDP's proposed targets for 2030, 38% reduction below 2005 levels, and those of the Green Party, 60% reduction below 2005 levels, are more stringent than the current federal target, with the Greens' target closest to being consistent with a 2-degree trajectory. However, no party platform includes modeling that shows how these targets would be achieved. These results paint a stark picture. Despite lofty claims and aspirational goals, there is no Canadian plan consistent with avoiding 1.5 or 2-degree warming. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, the rhetoric of your party on climate change does not match the numbers. Nonetheless, there are important choices to be made. Despite the scary headlines about 12 years left to act, the message of last year's IPCC report was not 1.5 degrees or bust. The message was that every action counts. The more that Canada and the world can do to reduce emissions, the less the planet will warm, and the less that people will suffer. For example, given our relatively low-carbon electricity system, there's every reason for the federal government to follow in British Columbia's footsteps and aggressively push towards electric and alternative fuel vehicles. Such actions are important, even if they are not sufficient to shift Canada to a 1.5 or 2 degree trajectory. By 2020, developed countries are supposed to be mobilizing at least $133 billion a year through grants, loans, and investments to help the developing world respond to climate change. Given our current emissions, Canada's fair share would be at least $5.5 billion per year, which is several times the current level. The longer we delay these actions, the more people will suffer, and the harder the transition will be on Canadians. Now, for the final 7 minutes I got left. The best and worst federal party climate plans graded. This is by Catherine Hayhoe and Andrew Leach in Chatelaine yesterday. A thermometer isn't blue, red, orange, or green. It doesn't give us a different answer based on which political party we support. But increasingly, today, our perspective on climate change depends not on the science, but rather on our political ideology. Climate change is a big problem, a global problem. And we know that our own personal choices will only get us a fraction of the way there. It's true that Canada is responsible for only about 2% of global emissions each year. But if you count up all the carbon we as a nation have released since 1900, we're in the global top 10 per person. Canada emits the same amount of carbon as 2.5 people living in the United Kingdom, 10 people in Zimbabwe, and more than 20 people living in Yemen. That's not fair, especially when you consider that some of the people who emit the least in the world's poorest nations are also the most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. Now, as a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe knows that climate system doesn't care how we cut emissions. But the science is clear that the faster we do so, the better off we'll all be. And if we want to meet our part of the Paris Agreement to hold the increase in global temperatures to below 2 degrees, if we can, we don't have a lot of time. As an economist, Andrew Leach has spent a lot of time thinking about how we can cut emissions through climate policies. How you define our action relative to others is subjective, but he likes to view Canadian policies through a global lens. If the world acts as we do, would we reach our global goals? Today, that answer is mixed. If everyone in the world implemented our current policies, we'd see significant emissions reductions. But if everybody lived and used energy the way we do, we'd be in much deeper trouble. That's why heading into the election, we're so interested in the proposals for cutting carbon emissions and preparing for the impacts. Hey, the Conservatives' real plan has lots of the right buzzwords, but its actual substance is vague, very vague. There are some bold promises about how this plan gives Canada the best chance at meeting the Paris targets, but there's not much evidence to back that up. What's good in it? The plan acknowledges that you can't expect to win a Canadian election if you don't have a climate plan. What's missing? Policies likely to lead to actual emission reductions. The final grade for the Conservative plan, D for ambition, F for feasibility. The Liberals' ongoing pan-Canadian framework, I'm just going to skip to the bottom line. What's good? There's a lot to like in the Liberals' plan. It builds on 4 years of experience, it tackles emissions across the economy, and it has measurable targets and ambitious goals. What's missing? The Liberals need to prove to Canadians that they can still meet our country's Paris targets with a new pipeline to the West Coast and new LNG facilities in British Columbia. They've adopted a more stringent net zero emissions target for 2050, but the policy path they've outlined won't get them to their goals. The grade is B for ambition and A for feasibility. The NDP's power to change plan. It says the plan is ambitious, but here's the problem. It doesn't explain how they're going to do it. What's good about the NDP plan? The NDP pledges to keep carbon pricing and sets deeper 2030 goals than the Liberals have today, with a focus on jobs and clean energy. What's missing? The details on how exactly they're going to cut carbon this quickly. And if their support base is negatively impacted, the pushback could be strong. They also need more serious consideration of federal versus provincial responsibilities. The grade on the NDP climate platform is A for ambition, D for feasibility. Now for the Green Party's mission possible. They go over all the statistics that I've already covered. What's good about the Green Plan? The plan sets strong overall goals that track with the most ambitious Paris targets and directly links its goals to specific policies and sectors of the economy. What's missing? A realistic path to achieve these goals, given the logistical and legislative challenges facing the country. The grade for the Green Plan is A+ for ambition, C- for feasibility. The conclusions: the Liberal, NDP, and Green plans all propose to cut carbon emissions, but only the NDP and Green plans aim to meet the Paris Agreement. However, their ambition is also their greatest challenge. The Liberals have the experience to know how big a challenge it is. They've acted in line with their promises and brought in significant new policies. The Conservative plans may actually make the situation worse, not better. And that's that. That is all the time we have. I did have other material. I would invite you to look into fossil fuel subsidies and geothermal energy, which should be a big deal here, but it's not. And the Aichi standards is also very interesting. But 2 days late, that's it for the View Up Here for what was supposed to be October 2nd, now October 4th. Does any party have a winning climate change plan? Not really. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on the View Up Here. Good night.